We've been up to our necks in Redmi phones recently, and the latest device we'll talk about is like a Redmi, but with a different look. It's the Poco X4 Pro 5G. Besides the back panel here, this is actually the same phone as the global Redmi Note 11 Pro 5G, or the Indian Redmi Note 11 Pro Plus 5G. I'm telling you, don't even get me started. But anyway, if you're a Poco fan, how does this compare to those sorts of phones? I'm Will for GSM Arena, and let's find out in our full review. This is the Poco X4 Pro 5G, and you might expect it to be the sequel to last year's Poco X3 Pro, but it's actually more similar to the Poco X3 NFC. Either way, it brings an eye-catching Poco design. The flat back panel is made of glass, and it refracts light in crisscross patterns, like laser beams. The plastic frame is flat too, and you get the in-your-face Poco logo up at the top, as an extension of the camera bump. You might take that to mean that the X4 Pro 5G is a more camera-centric device, but that's not really the case here. It is worth mentioning though that there's IP53 rated protection against dust and light splashes. While last year's X3 phones had an LCD, the Poco X4 Pro 5G has a 6.67-inch AMOLED with a 1080p resolution, Gorilla Glass 5 protection, and a fast 120Hz refresh rate. The screen is very responsive thanks to a 360Hz touch sampling rate, and the high refresh rate makes movements like swiping and scrolling quite smooth. The screen refresh rate isn't adaptive to save energy though. This display doesn't have HDR10 support, but it provides deep AMOLED blacks and decently accurate colors. And it's all pretty sharp with a pixel density of around 400 ppi. Brightness is good too. We measured a maximum of around 480 nits when using the manual slider, and the screen boosts to around 750 nits in auto mode when in bright conditions. The Poco X4 Pro 5G has a headphone jack and a pair of stereo speakers. The speakers are well balanced and earned a score of good on our loudness charts. The quality is pretty good too, with well presented mids.
I'm wide awake, but you're a nightmare. I can't escape, I'm seeing you everywhere. Words that you say poison the air.
For storage, the Poco X4 Pro 5G comes with either 128 or 256 gigs, and is expandable through microSD. And to wake up and unlock the phone, you can use the fingerprint reader which is built into the power key. It's lightning fast. Like most of the recent Xiaomi smartphones, the Poco X4 Pro 5G's interface is the newest MIUI 13 running over Android 11. There are a couple of differences on a Poco device though, like you can't disable the app drawer and have all the apps on the home screen. If you'd like to find out more about MIUI 13's functions and features, you can check out our dedicated video. Poco started out as a flagship killer brand, but now it's evolved into something different. The X4 Pro 5G doesn't bring a high-tier chipset like the X3 Pro, but instead has a Snapdragon 695 5G. This means that you now get connectivity to 5G networks. But as far as performance goes, the X4 Pro 5G is a clear downgrade from the X3 Pro. And it isn't much of an upgrade over the Poco X3 NFC either. While regular tasks run well, this is not a phone you'd want to do a lot of heavy gaming with. The Poco X4 Pro 5G has a large 5000 mAh power pack, and it was able to score a great 119-hour endurance rating in our tests, comparable to the Redmi Note 11 Pro 5G. One clear upgrade over last year is 67-watt fast charging, where before it was 33 watts. Of course, the adapter comes in the box. With it, we were able to charge the Poco X4 Pro 5G from 0 to 75% in half an hour, whereas last year's model and charger could achieve around 50%. Now on to the Poco X4 Pro 5G's cameras. It has a high-res 108 megapixel main camera, paired with an 8 megapixel ultra-wide and a 2 megapixel macro cam. 12 megapixel photos from the main cam are okay. There's an acceptable level of detail for this price range, and you get true-to-life colors and a balanced dynamic range. These photos are rather noisy though. Portrait photos have proficient subject separation. It's not perfect, but it's good for the class. 8 megapixel photos from the ultra-wide are soft and have just an average amount of detail and some visible noise. It's decent enough for this price range though. The dynamic range is good thanks to HDR, and the distortion correction is on point. Close-up photos from the 2 megapixel macro camera have a passable amount of detail, okay colors, and good dynamic range. Focus is fixed though, and it can take trial and error to get a sharp photo. In low light, the main cam does a good job. These photos have enough detail and true-to-life colors, and the noise levels are okay. Turning on the night mode results in a brighter exposure, restored highlights, and more detail, especially in shadows. The colors are more saturated and noise is cleaned up too. The ultra-wide cam's nighttime photos are barely usable. They're dark and noisy with dull colors. There's no night mode support for this camera either. Selfies come from the 16 megapixel front-facing cam, and they are alright. There's an adequate level of detail, accurate colors, and low noise. Last year's Poco X4 Pro and Poco X3 NFC could shoot video in 4K, but here you're limited to 1080p resolution, an unfortunate result of a less powerful chipset. Still, 1080p footage for the main cam is good. There's enough resolved detail, realistic colors, balanced sharpening, and adequate dynamic range. There's always-on electronic stabilization too, which does result in a bit less sharpness. The ultra-wide camera shoots good 1080p clips. The level of detail is decent for this sort of camera, and there's good dynamic range and accurate colors. So that's the Poco X4 Pro 5G. You get an interesting looking, water-resistant design, a nice high refresh rate AMOLED, stereo speakers, great battery life, and pretty fast charging, plus you get 5G connectivity too. However, the chipset is much less capable than last year, and that results in lower camera quality and the loss of 4K video recording. Because of that, I wouldn't recommend the Poco X4 Pro 5G over the Poco X3 Pro, and it isn't even much of an upgrade over the Poco X3 NFC. Now on the other hand, if you happen to be comparing this phone to the Redmi Note 11 Pro 5G, you get the same specs but for a lower price, so in that case it could be worth considering. Thanks for watching guys, stay safe and see you on the next one.